Like I even have a whole. Maybe you can show it a little bit, like a whole studio light thing set up here. Like, yeah, you can hardly
Oh,
see it, but
beautiful.
like all
Dude, you're
that
doing better
stuff.
than me.
It's mostly because of the conferences this year. Like you have to record some videos, and you want them to look good. You want everything to sound good. You want like the whole thing.
Yeah, super cool. What conferences have you done this year so far?
Oh, I literally forgot most of them. Like they were mostly very small, to be honest. There were a few around
Right.
WWDC. I did Dot Swift in Paris, which was just in time before everything locked down.
Cool.
But otherwise, yeah, just a bunch of small names. I cannot even remember them. It was a hectic period around WWDC where I just really said yes to everybody and just was like, just tell me what Zoom meeting to join and when, and I'll be there.
Your conference experience as a speaker was just clicking on a lot of links for a few weeks and then talking to a screen.
Much. Yes. It's very different where normally you go to a place and you know everything about the conference. Here it's also funny because I had once where like 10 people attending and there's like 200 people attending, and I mean this whole online format it's so weird.
Yeah, I think, but that's really cool because the one interesting thing is that the difference between speaking to 200 people over Zoom and 2,000 people over Zoom is like inconsequential, whereas in person, the difference would be like almost too overwhelming to go from one to the other. So that is like a really cool thing about online conferences is from a nerves perspective or comfort perspective, you don't have the same anxiety. So if anyone is really insecure, it's actually quite an interesting format to experiment with.
Yes. Yeah. One thing that's more scary is like, what if my internet cut out like 10 minutes in and people are yelling at me like, you're frozen, we can't hear you, and you don't notice. So one thing I started to do is to just join the room with my iPad so I could see myself. So that way, at least I would know that I was still there.
Very clever.
Yeah, it's like I've never had it happen to me where I actually dropped out of the conference, but it's very nice being able to look at the iPad and say, okay, I can still like I'm still there.
I'm still there. And I bet you now that the one time you don't use your iPad, something's going to happen.
Yes, 100%.
Like you've set it up.
100%. Yes.
But cool, Donny, thanks so much for being on the podcast. It's really cool to have you, albeit virtually, with me and chatting to me.
Yes, very happy to be on.
So I've prepared a few rapid fire questions that you haven't seen. It's just to get some insight into who you are. So don't think about them too hard, and we'll just sort of zip through them before we jump into the main conversation. But as a start, after a really tiring day, how do you spend your evening?
Oh, that's a good question. It depends. It usually does involve pouring myself a good glass of whiskey. Like that will always be part of it. Sometimes I will sit down and be on my PlayStation a little bit, play some Final Fantasy or some Call of Duty or whatever. Other times I'll just sit down at my computer and maybe program a little bit. However, if my day was mostly stressful because of programming, it is more likely that I will fire up the PlayStation and do some casual gaming. Or playing the guitar. That is also a big part of relaxing for me. So there's really three things, and depends on the day.
Awesome. And tea or coffee?
Coffee.
How do you take it?
Black.
And what's a really good book that you've read recently?
I am still reading it, but it is really good. It's called Algorithms to Live By. I cannot remember the names of the authors, so we're going to have to look that up and we can add it in the show notes.
Yes.
But it's really good, and it teaches a lot of very cool, fundamental computer science-y algorithms using a very practical sort of approach. So it doesn't really go into like how would you implement it on a computer. It just tells you like how would you apply it to real life, which is very cool.
Yeah, I've read that book as well. It's really cool. I will, as you said, I'll add the author and even the Audible link in the show notes because that was a really good book.
I'm about halfway through. I love it.
Yeah, it's really good, really good. And as you said, there's that cool. It relates it to very real life scenarios, which is really really interesting. Cool. And then what is something you wish existed but doesn't?
That is a complicated question. I would say, sort of from a very selfish, practical perspective, a big enough battery that is secure enough to store all of the power that people collect in solar panels and use it to supply homes with power during the night or when there's not much sun. Just because these batteries are technically not safe, I think, currently, and also very big and very expensive. So that is one thing I would love to exist. So in short, better battery technology, I guess.
Interesting. And then what is something that you're glad you said no to recently and why?
That would be speaking at a conference. It was not even that close. It was like in, I think, November or October. But with the whole COVID situation and me planning my wedding, which is in 2 weeks, and all that stuff, I just felt a little bit overwhelmed. And it felt very liberating to just say no, even though I knew that was far out and I would be able to do it. Just not having to think about it made me very happy.
And then what is one thing that's cost you less than 50 euros, but was the best investment most recently?
Oof. I haven't bought a lot of things recently. I would say dinner. Just a very nice dinner with my fiance.
I 100% back that treating yourself to a nice meal is indeed a very good
Yes.
investment, albeit short term. But cool, thanks so much. Those were some really interesting answers. And yes, very good book recommendation at the top of that as well. So cool. But just a little bit of introduction before we jump into the main conversation. Could you just explain to me a little bit about Disney streaming services, and maybe just like explain to me, like I'm five, what the main thing you do as a company is?
Sure. Yeah. So Disney Streaming Services is, well, it's basically what it says. It is a streaming services branch of the Disney company. So it is the Walt Disney Company that we all know and love. Except we take care of a lot of the video streaming stuff. We don't do everything that Disney streams in video, but we do everything for Disney Plus. That is our main focus. We also do ESPN and MLB and probably more that I don't even know about. My main focus is building an SDK that is used in several apps, amongst which Disney Plus, which allows all of the apps to communicate with our backends. So it takes care of user login, it takes care of sessions, it takes care of DRM protection, of video streaming, downloads, really almost anything where the apps would go to the network goes through us. So that is what I work on for all the Apple platforms. So it's on tvOS, it's on iOS, and really that's the only platforms we support, unless you want to count iPad OS as a separate one. So,
And
yeah.
just for someone who hasn't had experience with that, for you personally, what is like particularly hard or interesting about some of the problems you solve on a day to day?
So all of the problems I solve involve something very abstract. So I don't work on the UI, I don't work on the app. I work on a framework that is used by other people. So every day I have to think about how other people are going to use the code that I write. And I have to do that without an app where I can run the code in. So I have to do a lot of testing, a lot of test-driven development, and that kind of stuff. So that makes it very interesting to solve problems because, like in apps, you can run the app and feel how it works. I have to sort of write a test that captures that feel and then run it and see if it succeeds, which is a very cool feeling because you actually get to do a lot of unit testing. But it's also really complicated because really the only reliable way to do this is through unit testing.
That's really interesting. It's like a step removed almost, because you have to, as you said, you have to think about how
Yes.
someone experiences the code you
Yes,
write. So that's really
because
cool.
like even if my code works, like I have to think of the public interface too. Like, is it not confusing? Is it documented properly? Is it hard to make mistakes? Because you don't want to build an API where it's very simple for app developers to pass in bad parameters or whatever. So yeah, it's a very interesting thing to work on.
And how big is your tech team at the moment? What sort of size team are you working in?
So the team that I work in directly is just the people that work on the Apple SDK, which is the three of us right now. And we are part of a bigger team of about 20 people, I would say. So we have SDKs for several platforms. So all those people are included in there. And then we have hundreds of developers
Mm.
on the entire product, of course. Like we have the backend, we have Android apps, we have iPhone apps, we have TV OS teams, we have teams that work on Xbox, PlayStation, browsers, all that stuff. So there's literally hundreds of us, but my direct team is only three people.
So you're someone who you give a lot of talks, you write articles and blog posts and stuff. You've also you're an author as well, but because of your sort of experience and stuff, you've given a lot of advice to people before, and you're passionate about sharing knowledge and also having other people share knowledge with you. And I think this idea of broadening your horizon as a developer is really important to you because you think that there are actually more sustainable ways of doing it as a dev. And something you've said to me before is that technologies come and go. So what's important and what's more important and longer lasting are some of the core principles that tie software together. And by focusing on that and really streamlining what you learn and how you learn it is going to last you in the long run far better than thinking about, like what technology should I be working on? So I think that's why you've really thought about it and focused on the way you learn and think in your own career as a dev. But could you maybe just start, just so we sort of have a bit of context into how you think about it? Like, what do you understand broadening your horizons as? Like, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, you already said a lot of it actually in your introduction for that question, but to me, it's very important as a developer that I do not only understand the landscape of what I use directly, which is at this point Swift for iOS and then iPadOS mostly, and it is not always going to be like that, right? It would be foolish of me to think that for the next, let's say, 40 years, I would be working with these exact technologies. 40 years ago, Swift did not even exist. iOS did not even
Right.
exist, right? So it's only reasonable to assume that things are going to change. So, as a way, broadening your horizon helps you prepare yourself for the unknown future. At the same time, having started as a developer that did ActionScript for Flash, moving through different languages into Swift has given me very interesting perspectives into the world of programming. You've seen different communities, different ways of doing things, different languages, different tools. So when I see something new in Swift, I sometimes think to myself, like, hey, I've seen this in Python, or I did this once in ActionScript, or hey, this also existed in JavaScript. And it really helps you frame things. And it also helps you, even like, let's say you want to implement a certain search algorithm or a sorting algorithm, and you find a perfect example written in JavaScript, but you've never looked at JavaScript before, then you cannot replicate that in Swift because you wouldn't know how. However, if you've broadened your horizons a little bit and looked at different programming languages and understand how they work, then suddenly you open up a whole new world of resources and ways of learning things that I think is very important.
So why is that so important or valuable to you as a developer? And maybe you can illustrate your answer with like giving me an example of a time when you've done something to broaden your horizon that's actually impacted that will had an impact on you.
Yeah, sure. So it really happens to me like all the time. It's a little bit of a line throughout my entire working career so far. I
Yeah.
just mentioned that I started with ActionScript, right? So as an intern doing ActionScript, and we had this PHP freelancer who sometimes built very simple endpoints that would allow us to send forms or download data, for example. And so one thing I did to broaden my horizon there was to be very curious about that and ask him like, "Hey, so you're only in on Wednesdays? Sometimes on a Thursday morning, I realize that I want something different or you need something slightly different, and it takes until Wednesday to fix it. Like, couldn't I maybe make small changes, right? Like just send you an email, ask you like, hey, can I add this field or whatever? And it's like, yeah, sure. So that's a very, very simple example where I broadened my horizon into PHP just by being curious. And I think every developer should constantly do that kind of stuff where they try to peek around the corner, right? Like after that internship, I was not good at PHP at all, but I had seen a little bit of it, so I understood like what people were doing with it. And then later, I landed a job where I had to use a lot of it, and then I learned other technologies, and that kept happening all the time. But also, like more recently, when I picked up that algorithms book that I talked about earlier, like you start thinking about things slightly differently, right? Like you look at it from a different perspective, and you get out of your little bubble, and you realize that a lot of the things you do are rooted in very, very old principles. Like there are very few things being done in programming right now that are truly new. Like almost everything has been done in some way, shape, or form. And it helps you ground yourself, I think. It helps you sort of place yourself somewhere on the map of the world of developing stuff. So yeah, I think it's a little bit less of a concrete example, other than it's something you do all the time.
Yeah.
Because it's really hard to pinpoint, like, that is one time where I broadened my horizon, other than I read something I didn't know before, which I think we should be doing all the time. Like, we should always be looking at things we didn't know before.
Yeah. But I really like that example you gave of how increasing your perspective or giving yourself a new way of looking at something could actually help you see that the thing you're trying to solve has been solved already.
Yes.
That it's an old problem with a new face. And if you're not reading, and if you're not trying to, I mean, reading is one example, but if you're not trying to broaden your perspective, you could actually be, spending all your energy and effort into trying to solve a problem that someone else way back, like even decades ago, has already solved in a different way.
Definitely, yes.
And you just won't be able to access that if you're not trying to think a bit broader. Yes. And as you said, out of your own bubble. So you've already mentioned that this like curiosity is really important, and that is one aspect that you need if you want to continuously broaden your horizon. But what other things does it need? Like, what do you as an individual have to do in order to broaden your horizon?
That is a really good question that I've thought about that a lot. Like, what does it take? And one thing that I see in a lot of developers is that they want to start programming, and they come in and it's like, well, should I learn a UI kit for Apple platforms, or should I go in and do Swift UI because UI kit's going away? And they have heard that programming moves so fast, right? And so they're scared that whatever they learn will be outdated in a year or two. However, if you stop thinking about it in that kind of a short term, and if you stop worrying about, what will happen a year from now, you will be far happier because you just learn whatever you want to learn, what feels comfortable. And I think to do that, you need a certain amount of maybe like guts, like you need to be able to say to yourself, like, I don't care what's going to happen to this programming language. I'm going to learn it, and I'm going to learn how to program. And I don't care if it's going to be in Swift, it's going to be in Objective-C or Python or Pascal or C or whatever you like or run into. If you see something in your life and you want to build an app or a website or program for it, just go ahead and do it and use whatever technology you find. So you also have to sort of, I guess, be, what's a good word for it? Like, purpose driven or goal driven. Like you have to want to go somewhere all the time without worrying too much about the consequence. Like, of course, if you want to build a career, I would be a little bit hesitant to say, like, just pick whichever language you like. There has to be like some demand for it as well. But at the same time, like, if you picked a language that's not really popular, then you learn how to program, you broaden your horizon all the time. Surely you can learn a new language decent enough to help you move on in your career within reasonable time. Like, of course, you're not going to be an expert at all the programming languages if you've learned one or two or three. They all have their nuances that you're going to have to learn. So yeah, like so to come back to the question, what do you need or what does it require to broaden your horizon all the time? I think curiosity is a very very big one. It's also not being too afraid to fail, not being afraid to learn, not being afraid to feel a little bit silly sometimes, right? Like you're very good at Swift, now you're doing JavaScript, you're doing all the things wrong. Like you have to sort of be able to say to yourself, like, hey, I'm a beginner all over again. Like I understand what I'm doing, but I'm a beginner and I don't care that it's going to look a little bit silly. I'm just going to do it. I think that are a couple of the key things that I would recommend everybody to try and do if they want to continue to grow.
Yeah. So I think curiosity is an exciting thing. Like that would be a requirement that I want to have. But
Yeah,
being okay with failing and being okay with like that discomfort and not knowing the consequences, like that sounds really scary and something that's
it
actually really
is.
hard to just do.
It is really scary to go from almost being the smartest person in the room to feeling like the dumbest person in the room sometimes. Because that's what it can feel like, right? Like you could be an expert in your field and then you switch fields a little bit and you're junior all over again. However, like if you would put yourself next, like if you have 10 years of experience and you're switching languages and frameworks and everything, you're going to feel like a junior all over again. But you also have to realize that you have these 10 years of experience, not only programming, but also 10 years of experience in learning and thinking and looking at things. So you're going to bump up to like that senior level where you're comfortable again in no time. So it is scary in the beginning, but like it'll be fine usually.
Yeah, and I think to your point earlier, if you aren't willing to be a junior again, you're never going to. It's very easy to become stuck then. Like if that's the
Yeah,
blocker, if that's the thing that stops you from trying something new, then you probably are going to dig yourself the hole that you were trying to avoid falling into.
definitely. Yes. Yes. You like every year you don't try to grow or expand or broaden. I feel like you're increasing your risk of working with a dying technology essentially.
Yeah, yeah.
And
So that's really
and even
cool.
if you're doing that, it's going to take years and years for that technology to be truly obsolete. But
Yeah, yeah. And the thing you mentioned as well was to be goal driven as like a really good or like a really good way to broaden your horizon. But
yes,
I just wanted to, because it seems it seems counterintuitive to be goal driven, but then to not that goal not be something like a particular language or particular framework. So how do you think about being goal driven without picking that framework or like getting too attached to a technology?
yeah. So that really depends. Like, how do you frame your goals, right? Like, is your goal I want to build a website for this app that I'm building, or is your goal I want to build a website using Swift as a backend or using a React as the JavaScript framework? And I think having that very vague goal of saying like I want to build this website, I feel like that's going to push you towards picking like the best technology or the easiest technology to learn or to help you look outside of your comfort zone, to just go on Google and like what are people using today to build websites and just pick whatever comes up first and try it and fail. Maybe like maybe it's the worst choice for the exact website you're building, but you're going to figure it out along the way. Or maybe you're not going to figure it out along the way and have the thing running for 5 years before you realize how horrible it all was. But at the same time, it's been running for 5 years. So how horrible was it really? You
Yeah,
got something done, you achieved a goal, and you were proud of it. So it doesn't matter, at least to me, especially if it's something you do for yourself. Like, I don't care if the code's going to be bad. Like, you ship something, that's far more important. And that's what I mean by being goal driven. Like, don't let the
right.
technologies bring you down. Like, just have a goal and go for it and just do whatever you have to do.
And the philosophy or analogy that comes to mind while you were talking there was this idea of like being okay with climbing the wrong mountain. That sometimes it can feel like this uphill slog and you don't even know if this is the right mountain that you should be climbing. But by getting to the top, you can actually see, you actually know now, oh, there's another mountain over there. I think that's the right one, which you wouldn't have been able to
Yes.
see if you stayed at the bottom of that mountain. So as you said,
Yeah.
even if you find out that that technology is like horrible, you've learned something new or
Yes.
you've
And at the
figured
same
out
time,
what.
with your mountain analogy, you still climbed a mountain. Right? You still
Yes.
did the work. You still
Yeah.
you still can tell your friends like, hey, I climbed that big ass mountain over there. Like, what did you
Yeah.
do today?
Yeah. Super. Okay, so now I'd love to dive into some of the practical ways that you think about your own learning and broadening your horizons. So, in terms of the first thing I wanted to touch on is like this idea that tech is as an industry moves very quickly, and there's many different facets and sides and things that are uh, exciting about it. So, what do you do in terms of topics? How do you focus where you put your energy?
That is the answer to that question really sort of differs like from week to week for me, but I have found that sort of as a general kind of rule that my best spent effort, in my opinion, is spent in reading old stuff. Because reading the old stuff, like the books that people have been recommending for 10 years or more, will show you that the part that even while our industry moves fast, it also moves incredibly slow. Like we're just finding the same solutions in like what I said, like new fresh coats of paint, but they're the same solutions to the same problems. And seeing that also helps me slow down at least. Like it makes me think that like you don't have to keep up with everything. Like it's new, but it's also not like that new, and it's not going to go anywhere
Yeah.
anytime soon. Let's just do whatever I'm doing right now. Focus on this, focus on that, and just wait to hop on certain trains, which really helps reduce like the anxiety that some people feel they have to learn something new, which I can really see every year in iOS developers around WWDC when Apple announces their new betas, their new stuff, the new APIs, and everybody's all excited. And they have people like Paul Hudson, who I don't know what he does, but I don't think he sleeps. He just types, types, types. He gets all these new tutorials and YouTube videos up. Like a week after WWDC, like he'll be ready for like the next iOS because he's covered it
Yeah.
all basically. Even though like he is still learning and updating all of his stuff, he's just working with what he has. You can really tell that there's a lot of people out there who are like, "Oh, damn it, I'm behind. Like I have to learn all this. I have to watch all the videos and try everything." And if you're constantly in that mode, like you're gonna feel very anxious like all of the time. However, if you like take a step back and think about it a little bit more, you can see like, okay, you know what, like this is not gonna go anywhere. I can take my time and like I can learn this later. So it's not even a topic that I focus on. It's more a broader thing where I focus on like trying to see the bigger picture. So any resource that helps me see that, be it like a book that teaches me about like project management like years ago, or a book that helps me understand how certain programmers write very clean testable code in Java, or if it's a blog about something that came out yesterday, I always try to think of like what's going to stay for the long term. And if I think it's going to stay for the long term, it's a topic that I'm interested in.
So what are some of the older I mean, we were just talking about older books or reading older resources. What are some of those yeah, what are some of those older resources that you've used or that you have recommended to people before?
Yeah, so one that I really like, it's more related to project management than it really is about programming, but it does help you see like how can I not overwork myself and how can I make promises to people that I can keep. And that book is called The Mythical Man
Hmm.
Month. A very famous quote from that book. I'm not even sure if the author is actually the one that came up with the quote, but it's quoted in the book. It takes a woman 9 months to create a baby, but it doesn't take 9 women 1 month, right?
Right.
And they use that analogy to describe that throwing more developers at a problem is not going to solve the problem quicker. And then they actually make the point that it could make the entire project go much slower because now all these developers have to coordinate, talk to each other, understand the requirements. So, especially if the project is already late, a way to make sure that it's going to be even more late is to add more developers. So that is a very interesting read that has some very counterintuitive points, but also a lot of things that you can talk about with your project managers and explain to them why they shouldn't hire that extra freelancer, but instead try to decrease noise and try to cut out some meetings so they can actually get work done. Another book that I really like is Design Patterns from, I don't know who are the authors exactly, but they're called The Gang of Four. That's what everybody knows them as. Um, that book there's nothing really in particular that I would say like that was a gem of wisdom from that one, except just everything and just design patterns in general. You start to see them every time, and they're just tried and tested solutions to existing problems. Then there's, let's say, one more, Clean Coder, which is a very interesting book as well. It goes into a lot of like how should you structure your code in terms of like making it good, and not necessarily like what architecture should you use, but like what is good code, like what are some requirements that all good code should have, and also as a coder, like how are you a good coder. Oh, and then one more is the pragmatic programmer, which I also really like because it seems very no nonsense, like getting stuff done, which is something
So
that I really like.
So what seems to be the common thread with all of these books, and I think you alluded to this already, so I'm just going to like paraphrase and contextualize here, but like the idea with those is that it seems like they take the step back and they look at the patterns behind or some of the logic behind things that can be applied across the board. And I think
Yes.
what's really cool about books like that is they actually, over and above the content they give you, they also help you think about how to learn or how to approach other problems, where you can actually, before you try and just solve the problem, you can take a step back, try and figure out what the main pattern is, and then use that going forward. And then every time you come across that pattern again, it's almost like how I guess like machine learning works or neural networks, that like it picks up one problem, figures out the main principles, and then it can just apply it over and over again. It doesn't have to use new energy every single time it comes into contact with the same thing.
Yes. Yes. I think that's a very good summary. It's really like broadening your horizon in the most literal sense of the word. Right? It's almost a bird's eye view of the programming
Yeah.
landscape. That
Yeah.
it also helps you see that it's not all that scary. Like people have been doing this for dozens of years, and they have been making the same mistakes. And right, like it just shows you that you're not. Well, I mean, like I wouldn't want to say like you're not doing anything revolutionary because some people truly are. But at the same time, like there is a paved path. Like there are things that you can learn from other people, and in general, just programming hasn't changed that much. And to me, that idea is very soothing.
Yeah.
It, you know, helps me just see the bigger picture, which I really like.
Yeah. And I like the way you phrased it earlier, that it's often just a new coat of paint. It's not like an entirely new wall. It's
Yes.
just a different way of looking at it. But can you just give me some concrete examples of what that learning looks like for you? I think you've already spoken about the algorithm book, so maybe you can tell me more about that. But I know you also have a blog, so we can maybe dive into
Yeah.
those two things.
Yeah. So usually what it means is that I just kind of discover a gap in my knowledge, right? Like I will figure out that I have been using something for a while, or I've been doing something for a while, or even that maybe I did something in the past and I kind of understood it, but then I figured out that maybe I didn't quite understand it. And a very recent example is that is actually last week when I stumbled upon a thing called an option set in Swift, and a coworker used it. And I saw that it had like integers and some bit shifting in there. And what it did is it stores a bunch of Boolean flags inside of a list of bytes, and those bytes are then stored as an integer. So I was like, I know this, right? I've seen this before, like I've done this before, but I couldn't remember. So then I sort of just started, and that was the good thing about broadening my horizon before, because I knew that I was looking at bit shifting. So instead of looking at how does Swift option set work, I was like, what is bit shifting? And then I figured out, okay, so bit shifting is like you have the integer 1, which in an 8-bit integer is 7 zeros and then a 1. And if you bit shift that to the left one position, you get 6 zeros, a 1, and then a 0, which equals to the integer 3, I believe, from the top of my head, or 2. It's 2. And so, right, and then you're like, okay, so then you have like 7 zeros in total, so it's 7 falses and a 1 true, and then the true is at that position. And then you can shift up more, and it's like, okay, so that is what an option set is, right? So that's why an option set has an integer as its raw value. That's also how you can store all these Boolean flags inside of an integer, because you just end up with something like 11001101. which has a bunch of truths and a bunch of falses in there, but it's also an 8-bit integer. And then it's like, okay, so then how would I know if, the third bit is true or not? It's like, okay, so I have to sort of like take that list of bits and compare it to some other list of bits, I guess. Then I figured out, like, oh yeah, wait, that's like bitwise operators, like the XOR and the OR and the AND and all that stuff, which is basic computer science, but like nobody really ever uses that every day. So you just learn it a little bit and forget it. And then I looked into that and I was like, okay, that's really cool. So now I understand how it works. And I wrote a blog post about it, published it on Tuesday, and now I have my own little resource. Like if I run into this again in 10 years, I'll be able to look back at my own writing and be like, oh yeah, that's how it worked. So that's, I think, a very good example of like, coming across something and having that little curiosity and having a little bit of pre-existing knowledge because you went very broadly instead of very, very narrow, and how that helps you learn new things, apply them, write about them, learn even more, broaden your language even more, broaden your knowledge even more, because now I like know how bitwise operators work, and I know that that exists in any language. So that's a lot of fun.
A blog is an interesting one because I think a lot of people have thought about it, or my assumption is that a lot of people have thought about it, but there's something scary about like, I don't know if I can write very well, or like people might think I'm being an idiot, or it's like a problem that someone else has solved and they're like, it's over here, didn't you see it? So what do you have, like any like advice or tips on how to do it without that anxiety?
Yes, well, so it's not very nice to say, but a lot of that anxiety is true. Like whenever I publish something, somebody will tell me that it's the wrong way to do something. Somebody will tell me that I'm being silly. Somebody will tell me that somebody else wrote about it and that somebody else wrote about it better than I did. So why did I even bother? That's the kind of feedback that you'll get every once in a while. And at that point, you have to think back and ask yourself, why am I blogging in the first place? And for me, it is because I think it's fun. It helps me learn. And I figured that I have a writing style that some people like. Like even if it's only 100 people that like the way that I write, I'm happy with that. And the rest of the world can hate it all they want, but me and my group of 100 loyal fans enjoy it, right? And even if some people learn a little bit from a few posts, I'm already happy. But my main purpose is to write for myself. Like I would probably still write, maybe less frequently, but I would probably still do it even if I would take the whole website offline and just have a bunch of markdown files. Because it's also just a nice little log or journal of how you've been learning and progressing over all these years.
And what method for writing helps you? Maybe in terms of like, where do you find time to do it? How long does it take you? What are some ways that you sort of fit it in?
So I one thing I always try to do is to keep it short enough. Like I don't want to spend 4 or 8 hours on a single blog or a single writing session. So usually my writing sessions are 2 hours max. Doesn't mean that I do everything in 2 hours. Sometimes during the week, I will be experimenting and learning and, looking at examples and thinking of topics. But then when I sit down, like I want to be able to just jam it out in 1 or 2 hours. And that helps keeping it short. It sometimes means that certain posts are a little bit more superficial than I would like. However, it's also an opportunity to write 1 or 2 follow-ups where you go more in depth. And that constraint really, really helps prevent me from writing a small book every time I want to publish a blog post. Or it also prevents me from not publishing at all because there's always more to be written on a topic. Right? So you'll sometimes see people that work on a post for 6 months before they publish it. And that's just because they probably also didn't sit down with the idea, like, I'm going to write something today and it's going to be published. But also because they probably didn't limit themselves enough. And then there's also, of course, the posts that are like really insightful and really took a whole bunch of time to research. And I get that those take a lot of time. But sometimes it's just giving yourself some constraints. And just writing for you. Don't worry about what people are going to say. Like, people are going to say nice things. People are going to say bad things. There's always somebody else that wrote about it. Like, nothing I write about is unique. But when you do find something to write about that's unique, that makes it extra fun to publish that post. Like, this is something that nobody wrote about yet. And then what you'll see is that other people start writing about the same thing too sometimes, which is always interesting to see. I always like it when that happens, because apparently people read that post of mine, and they're like, oh, I can write about this too. Like I have thoughts on this or opinions on this, and it's always nice to see what other people are doing. And sometimes they write, they have a different approach, or they have different opinions, or they prefer different styles, and that's all great. Like I think that also helps people who are learning if they get multiple styles, like multiple ways of talking about things, which is also why you shouldn't let somebody else writing about something hold you back too much, because the way you say something might help it click for a person.
Right. So I mean, we've spoken about like how you think about what to learn, and we've sort of spoken about like taking a step back, looking at principles and patterns of thinking as opposed to actual things themselves. And also, I think the thing you mentioned, which is actually really useful, and I hadn't thought about it. So it seems very obvious in hindsight now, but I hadn't thought about it the way you put it. That like instead of looking for new things to learn and feeling so overwhelmed by the stuff out there, it's like actually look for gaps in knowledge you have right now and start there. Like what don't I know right now? And I think the minute you start that and you warm up that muscle, you'll be able to find new things you don't know all the time, because we know we don't know a lot. And that's a really cool way to start streamlining your learning, because then you're actually solving for real problems you have now, as opposed to trying to preempt all the stuff you won't know and might need in the future. And then you mentioned things like reading old books. Blogging is a really useful way of practicing some of that knowledge. But I think a topic which maybe is a little bit controversial, and I know a lot of people have different opinions on this, but for someone, for example, who wants to only focus on one language and specialize and become really good at that, how do you think about like depth versus breadth of knowledge and learning? Like, is it better to get a wide range of topics, or like to pick one focus area and like deep dive?
Yeah, so that is a very cool question, and I think you're always going to end up depth-wise at some point. So to give you an example, like the Swift language, there's a lot of people using Swift and exclusively using Swift as well. I feel like if that's what you want to do, then that's great. Like you don't have to learn anything else if you only want to write Swift. However, you are going to find yourself like going deeper and deeper into Swift. So you're going to look into all of its little details, or you're going to eventually learn like how does certain types work in Swift? How does the compiler do certain things? And then you're going to hit a wall. You're going to be like, okay, wait, so I know everything about Swift, but the compiler's written in C++, I believe it is. So yeah, then you're going to get stuck at some point, right? At some point, you're going to not be able to learn more about Swift unless you broaden yourself a little bit and learn about C++. At which point, you're going to realize that you don't know a thing about how a compiler works, so you're going to learn a little bit about compiler technology. And before you know it, you're back at breadth, right? You're learning compilers, so you figure out like, oh wait, there's also compilers for this and that and so, and then you're going to learn more and more C++, and then to be a Swift expert, you have to go breadth.
So, have you heard of T-shaped skills before?
I have.
Because that is something that's come to mind just now. And I think, so just for anyone who doesn't know, I think I first heard it in terms of recruitment, but the idea is that you have, it's almost like a generalizing specialist. You have like the breadth to sort of collaborate across many disciplines, but you have one vertical stream that you're like a specialist in. But I really like the way you described it now, because that almost like to throw an extra term into it. And maybe we're coining it today, folks. Maybe we're coining it, but like almost like a root shaped skill set, where the deeper you go, you have tiny little branches of breadth.
Yes.
And the more depth you get, you have little like areas. So like you come into contact with the compiler and you do a little tiny bit of like breadth across, but then you keep going deeper. So there's always going to be a combination of the two. So that's, I think that's a really interesting way that I hadn't thought about it.
Yeah. I think going depth only is going to harm a person at some point, right? If you're doing Swift depth only and you hit the compiler and you're like, well, I don't know compilers, I only want to learn Swift, then there's only so much that you can learn. Right? There's a very finite amount of knowledge you're going to get. And anybody who is who is going to do that little bit of branching out and going deeper and deeper is going to at some point like pass you in a way, and it's going to make you as a developer feel like maybe all of the quirks in using Swift, but wouldn't it be cool if you also understood why that quirk's there and how you can like make use of it? Like I know in JavaScript people use its quirks to do crazy tricks all the time. But to understand them, you have to know a little bit about how JavaScript works and to responsibly come up with such a trick instead of only copy and pasting that trick from Stack Overflow because you didn't want to go deeper into browser technologies, for example.
Yeah. So then in terms of like motivation for always learning, because I think it's worth acknowledging that like learning and growth can get tiring. It is like not an easy thing unless you like are very like intentional about it, and that you do give yourself like slack every now and then, that it doesn't have to be like every minute of every day. And I think you spoke about purpose, which in my opinion is a very powerful element of learning. It's like you need to know why you're doing it. If it's just for the sake of being the most intelligent person in the room, you're going to tire yourself out very quickly. Whereas if it's like I really want to be able to build a website for myself, that is like a thing that you can achieve, and it feels like a more holistic goal. But in terms of that motivation, like how often do you personally revisit your purpose for learning, or how do you think about where you get that motivation from?
So I do it every once in a while. I just look at myself and I think, like, am I where I wanted to be a year ago? Or like if I thought about myself a year in the future, like, am I doing what I wanted to do? And if not, I don't punish myself for it. Like I don't say like, you wanted to do this, why are you not doing it? Go do it. I'm like, why did I not get around to it? Like I've been saying for years, like I want to, have a very, very strong computer science foundation. So I want to figure out like what do people learn in university and get some of those books and like really like go down to like the assembly level. And I tried it a few times, and every time I'm thinking like, when am I ever going to use this? Or like if I were to explain to somebody why I learned it, why did I? Like, was there a problem in my work that I couldn't solve because of this? Or is there something I want to build? And that's usually like, I kind of want to learn it because I feel like there are tiny little gaps in my knowledge that would have been filled had I studied computer science. And then my first thought is, I'm going to study computer science myself, which is it's not the correct solution. The correct solution is to figure out what these gaps are and to fill those gaps, because then I have a reason to be filling the gap, because I encountered something and I was like, I had to help. I had to ask somebody for help, and they obviously knew what they were doing and they got their computer science degree. And to them, it seemed trivial. So like, I'm better off asking that person, like, hey, you were able to solve that problem. Like, was it experience? Was it something you've seen before? Is it something that you learned? And if it's something that you learned, like, how can I learn that too? Or can you teach me? And that is far more effective. So if I look back at that goal of becoming more computer sciencey, the reason I'm not doing it is very simple. It's because I don't have a reason to do it other than doing it for the sake of doing it. That's exactly what you just said. It's going to tire yourself out really quickly. So then I just tell myself like, there's always next year. And next year I will not have bought the books. I will not have done the studying.
But I think what's interesting is there's a very nuanced difference that you've highlighted there. There's like the approach where you can say, I'm going to preempt every problem I ever have and study this really big degree in order to do that. Or there's the approach of zooming in on a very specific problem, figuring out how to solve that, and from there, taking steps back until you get to the general principle or the general pattern. And that sort of learning or that sort of approach, it's way easier to not feel overwhelmed by this like massive undertaking. And you're also solving for immediate problems. You're not trying to preempt every single scenario and every single problem, which I think, as you said, technologies come and go. So you could spend all this time trying to preempt all these things that then aren't relevant in a year or two time.
Yes. Yeah, and there's also a little bit of a balance there, of course, because like you don't want to preempt everything, but if you're only learning things as you encounter them, I feel like you're going to frustrate yourself really
Right.
quickly, because then every problem that you have to solve is a new problem for a
Right.
long, long time. So there's a little bit of a balance there, and I feel like that's why I'm reading a book every once in a while, is because that will prime me for some of these problems. And if I find them
Yeah.
interesting enough, I will read more. If not, I will learn more when I encounter them, and I will remember that I read something about it somewhere. And I'll be able to go
Right.
back and be like, ah, yeah, that was the thing, and then learn it as needed. So there's a
Yeah.
little bit of a balance there, and it's not. I don't think there's one solution that fits everybody, because I know some people that like learning so much and hate struggling so much that they would rather study the entire degree before even writing a single line of code, because they would be frustrated if they had to type something that they didn't understand what happened inside of the processor, for example. Whereas
Yeah.
I don't care what the processor does. The processor just has to do the math correctly, and I'm happy.
Yeah. But I think there, for me, the motivation is still different, and I think that's the key. Is like it's not, you're
Yeah.
not motivated to learn as much as you can because you feel like if you don't, you're a bad dev. It's like, I love learning so much. I love pulling core principles from things. Like, that is still a sustainable motivation. That is something that you can keep up, as opposed to something that you feel like you'd fall behind on. So I think
Yeah.
that's still a key difference there. And as I said, there's a balancing act. Well, as you said, sorry, I took credit for your thing.
That's okay.
As you said, there's a balancing act, for sure. But yeah, I think that the motivation there makes a big difference. But then, just as a closing point, what is the biggest lesson you've learned, as a dev, about the value of broadening your knowledge and your horizons? And maybe we can take it from a point of, like, if you had to speak to your younger self, what would you say about the value there?
Oof. Also, I'm quite happy with what my younger self did, so I wouldn't tell my younger self to do
Props to
anything
him.
differently per se. But like one experience that I can take on that was a big lesson for me was, um, during my graduation period, I was an intern somewhere, and I was working with PHP in that internship, and um, my lead left, and we were a team of two, so it was just him sort of counseling me. And sort of straight out of college, I took over from him and was the only developer working on our CMS.
Yeah.
However, the company didn't have many clients anymore, and things were slowing down a lot. So I got a little bit bored, and I talked to my team lead again. And I told him about that, and I told him I was thinking of leaving. And he was like, "You also knew a little bit of JavaScript, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, a little bit. Like we did that one project. Like I guess you didn't hate my code, and you're asking me because you're looking for somebody to do JavaScript." He was like, "Well, exactly that, yes." So I interviewed there, and I was going to do some JavaScript there. And however, they also expected me to work on the backend a little bit and to learn a little bit of MySQL, because that's what they were using as a database. It's like, well, fine, let's do it. Like I did a little bit of MySQL too in PHP, so how different can it be? And a few months later, I found myself fairly comfortable doing CSS, JavaScript, HTML, and also doing Express.js, the framework. And like that would not have been possible had I not wanted to broaden myself a little bit. But then, as coincidence wanted it, the backend leads, like the CTO and the team of leads, figured that Node.js, or the Express.js framework, was holding us back regularly. So they wanted to switch over to Python, which I had never done before. But younger me was just like, you know what, screw it, I'm going to jump in and learn some Python. Like, how bad could it be? Turns out it was pretty complicated. Like, it took me a while to understand, but I did it. Like, I learned it. And they also switched databases to PostgreSQL, which I also learned, which was for my usage identical to MySQL. But still, it was new. Like, it was something new to look at. And then they wanted to have an iOS app, and they hired a freelancer who didn't work fast enough. And we were looking at least one person internally who could help him, but we all had to learn it. And young and curious me was like, I'll do it. Like I did a little bit of iOS Objective-C stuff in school. Like, let's see where that goes. And then for like 6 months, I was working on the iOS app all the time. And so I feel like that is a lesson I've learned, is you're going to learn so much more if you just jump in and broaden, learn everything you want to learn. And, if given the opportunity to switch technologies, don't be afraid to do it. I mean, I've been doing mostly iOS ever since, but then in my previous job, we ran into a situation where the apps were done, so iOS and Android were finished, and we still had a lot of work to do on the back end. And that's where I was like, hey, so instead of sitting down and being bored, I can just go help the backend developer now because I know PHP. Like, I can do this. Like, I had never done the Symfony framework before, but like at that point, I was confident that, like having seen so many different technologies, like how different could that one be? And I was able to help us deliver on time because of that. I was able to help fix some critical bugs really quick, only because, like I said, yes to everything when I could. And I think that is something that we should all try to do. Like not overstep, right? Not get overconfidence. Like I can do anything, but if somebody offers you the opportunity to switch tech stacks, if you just tell them like I've never done this before, but I want to learn it, just do it. If they want to give you that opportunity, you would, yeah, just do it. I think that's great. It's a little bit scary too, right? Like I was working with a bunch of developers that built a big social network in the Netherlands that had done Python for years, and I was just like the young guy who was like, yeah, sure, I'll help. But at the same time, like being the junior between these like super senior people taught me so much about like everything, not just Python, but just everything backend related. So yeah, that's a lesson I've learned. It's just interesting things will happen if you don't go too deep and just broaden yourself.
Donny, thanks so much for chatting and sharing your insights and experiences. I think it's this is one of those conversations where we could keep going and talk about all kinds of things.
Yes, totally agreed.
But thanks so much for, like I said, sharing some of your insights and lessons, and also giving some like real life and practical ways that you yourself think about learning. I think it's, for me, if no one else, for me, it's really useful to hear, and I've certainly learned a thing or two. So thanks for your time, and thanks for being so willing to chat.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. This was a blast to talk about. It's also a little bit of a trip down memory lane for me, like a lot of things I haven't thought or talked about in a while. So that is very cool. And like you said, I think we could keep going for hours.
And where can people follow you online? Where can they find you and reach out to you?
Yes, so they can find my website and my blog on donnywals.com. They can find me on Twitter. Handle's just Donny Wals, my name. And yeah, that's probably, if you want to reach me or ask me anything, Twitter is probably the place to go.
Fantastic. I will link all of that stuff in the show notes, and also all the books and resources you mentioned, of which there are many. So people will have a bunch of stuff they can dive into immediately after listening to this. But hopefully chat to you again soon. Keep safe with pandemic things. I'm sure we'll still be talking about it for a while. But it was really cool chatting, and hopefully have you back soon again.
I'd be happy to be back. Thank you.